Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in the Wimmera Productive Soils Series, supported by the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. My name is Prue Cook. I'm the Director of Nine Creeks Consulting, and I'll be your webinar host across the series. This webinar series explores farm practices and innovations that Wimmera farmers can use to increase soil organic matter and improve profitability. The webinars will examine existing and emerging approaches, focusing on local relevance and delivering current research, essential considerations and guidance on implementation. Let's get straight into today's topic by introducing today's presenter, John Stuchbery. John is a consultant with S&D Consulting and provides technical and management advice to farm businesses in the Wimmera and Mallee regions of Victoria. John has also been involved with group facilitation and various R&D projects over the years. Before I hand you over to John, we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you can type your questions in at any time using the chat function that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. You'll also be sent a recording of this webinar after it finishes, so don't worry if you need to leave early. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Prue, and good morning, everybody. So the topic this morning is using your rotation to improve soils and profit, the role of brown manure, long fallow and cover cropping. So I'm just going to start off by talking about improving soils and then sort of move on to profit at the end of the presentation. So when we're talking about improving soils with rotations, we're really, apologies for that. It's the number one mistake to make when you're presenting. We're talking about improving soils with rotation. We're really talking about improving soil organic matter. So by way of background, I'll just sort of explain a bit about what that is as a refresher. So when we're talking about soil organic matter, we also talk about soil organic carbon, and we're essentially talking about the same thing. So, but soil organic matter is all that organic material that's within the soil that's less than 2 millimeters in size. So that means that like roots and bits of straw and lumps of whatever organic material in the soil that are bigger than that 2 millimeter size aren't counted as soil organic matter or soil organic carbon. So that all gets sieved off in the soil testing analysis. So soil organic carbon, yeah, it's a term that we use and probably hear more about. Really, it's sort of standard terminology, is 58% of soil organic matter. And that's divided up into three fractions. There's the particulate organic carbon, which is the larger parts between 2 millimeters and down to 0.05 millimeters. And that looks a lot like the broken down roots and stubbles and residues and things like that at a microscopic level. So that part of the soil, that fraction cycles fairly quickly. And when you see sort of lifts in soil organic carbon and drops in soil organic carbon, it's usually that component that moves up and down fairly quickly. The second fraction on that list, the humus, that's smaller, 0.05 millimeters, and that turns over a lot more slowly. So that's the turnover of that is in decades. So it could be 10 to 40 or 50 years when that humus is actually turned over. But that humus is thought to be the reserve of nutrients for when it does get turned over. And the third component is resistant organic carbon, and that's like charcoal-like, so it's really residues left over from historical burnings, whether it's stubble or forests or even like soot from whatever. So that gets turned over in thousands of years. It's doesn't really contribute much to the soil, in terms of for our benefit. So it does have a bit of a role in holding on to nutrients like particularly potassium and ammonium, but to all intents and purposes that doesn't do much at all. Functions of the soil organic carbon, they're a reservoir of nutrients and particularly nitrogen. We're all aware that we get nitrogen mineralised from that soil organic carbon during the season. Pretty much it's available for use by plants. So also increases water holding capacity, increases soil structure, sort of makes more organic carbon, healthier, more resilient soils, which flow on to production. So thinking about building up soil organic carbon, the best way to think about it is that top point is soil organic carbon is really a function of the inputs to the soil. So that's like plant-based carbon. So that's the residues of the crops regrowing, including the stubbles and the root material. And so they're the inputs. And we can also have, amendments, added amendments like chicken manure and pig manure, those sort of things. But I guess for a lot of people haven't got access to that. So we're relying on, plant-based carbon. And then the other component of that is the losses of soil organic carbon, which is as a result of the microbial activity of turning that over. They consume the carbon, use it for energy. Some of it's released as CO2, and the nutrients that are tied up in that are released for use by plants. So that's pretty much, keep that in your mind when you're sort of just thinking about how to manage or influence soil organic carbon in the soil. So to increase soil organic carbon, things like, which are common practice now, reducing cultivation, retaining residues, having diverse rotations, though in pasture phases, there's good data around to show that those those practices do make a difference and can build soil organic carbon, and are effectively, what you're doing there is you're just adding material, plant-based carbon to the system. And the last one, cover cropping, there's not a lot of data for the medium rainfall zone around, but there is work being done at the moment. But the principle is still the same with cover cropping. If you're growing material, if you're producing plant-based carbon, that will eventually go back into the soil. So and the last point there was the amendments. I guess the big issue of that, which I already touched on, is availability and cost. Look, if you can, you've got access to it, that's great, but not everybody has. So the other point to consider there is that yearly gains are small. So it takes considerable amount of time to build those levels. We're only getting a little small increments each year. And I guess the other points there are that the actual amount of carbon that can be added is determined by soil. So soils that have a high clay content can hold more carbon. They can protect it from breakdown and turnover by the microbes, whereas compared to sands, they just inherently can't sort of hold that carbon at the same sort of level. And the other sort of consideration with storing or building soil carbon is the starting levels. So if you have again, there's good data to demonstrate this, but if you come off a paddock that's had a log pasture phase and soil carbon levels are quite high, there actually is an upper limit. And so, you'd be limited in how much carbon you could build in that soil. But if you took the same soil, with a lower starting level of organic carbon, same management, you can actually build that sort of much at a faster rate than you can when you've got a higher soil organic carbon. So there are factors you've got to consider. But I think the most probably important one to understand in our environment is that it's strongly influenced by annual rainfall. So if management is consistent, so what I mean by that is we're not changing management to change organic carbon levels. The biggest influence from year to year is annual rainfall or growing season rainfall. And what's happening there is that in the high rainfall years, we grow a lot of material. We produce a lot of plant-based carbon that goes back into the system, and on the other side of that, the microbes are working away at turning that carbon over, but we're adding more carbon than the microbes are turning over. And then when we get to a low rainfall year, we're adding much less plant-based carbon to the system, but the microbes are still beavering away at the same rate. So we're actually adding less than what's being turned over by the microbes. So in that scenario, the total organic carbon will drop. It's sort of a bit like a bucket, with you've got a tap coming in and a tap coming out. It's coming out at constant level. Some years it's running at a faster rate. Other years it's a slower rate. So the level comes up and down. So it was interesting that there's some trial work, excuse me, from New South Wales that showed in some rotation work where they were trying to monitoring organic carbon, they got consistent increases over a period of, I think it was 8 or 9 years, something like that. And then in 1 year, they lost all those increases just due to seasonal conditions. So yeah, really to get, I suppose, look at measuring increases in organic carbon, we've probably got to measure them or pick up a consistent increase over a long period of time. So just moving on to the influence of rotations, this is some data from the SCRIME trial that's conducted in Longrenong. So SCRIME stands for Sustainable Crop Rotation in Mediterranean Environment. And so what they've done here started in 1998. They've run some different crop rotations since then. That's still going now, and measured production and all sorts of other things. But this data is soil organic carbon data under the different crop rotations. So on that left-hand scale or axis, it's the depth of soil. At each one of those points is the sampling or testing depth, and each line represents a different crop rotation, and across the top is the organic carbon. So I guess the main thing I want to highlight was the black dotted line is the organic carbon that was measured when this experiment commenced in 1998. And then these other measurements were taken in 2018. So I guess what I wanted to highlight here was this first. Get my mouse to show up. Hopefully you can see that. Is this this purple diamond is just native grass, so nothing happened on that. And you can see if you follow that line down, organic carbon levels haven't really changed in that period. The second one is, my mouse has come back, is the brown dot. So in that rotation, that had a pasture phase, it was lucent. So in that just sort of demonstrates that in that lucent phase, there's a lot of plant-based carbon going back into the system, and that's actually been able to maintain soil organic carbon levels over that period. If we go back to the left, we've got the green triangles. So that rotation had green manure in it. And again, you can see in that green manure phase, that was adding material, plant-based carbon to the system more. And that has pretty much maintained those organic carbon levels. If you contrast that to the blue line with the squares on the left, that's a fallow wheat peas rotation. So that has actually, as you can see, it's dropped organic carbon over that 20-year period. So what's happening there is in that fallow phase, there's no plant-based carbon being added to the system. And also because that was a fallow stored water, the yields were higher, and good yields carting a lot more nitrogen out of the way and out of the system. So I guess to put that a little bit of context, I guess the other interesting point is that we sort of think with legumes we are fixing nitrogen, and we are, but the pulse, when we harvest a pulse crop, where a lot of that nitrogen that's fixed is taken off the paddock in the grain. So it's quite interesting here if you look at the brown squares. Sorry, the brown squares, that's a peas, wheat, barley rotation. That underneath that is a wheat rotation. It's a blue diamond, and you can see right down the bottom they separate out a little bit, but they are virtually the same organic carbon levels after 20 years. So I guess that just sort of making the point that the peas really aren't adding a lot to it over and above the continuous wheat in terms of carbon. So to summarise that a little bit, the green brown manure pasture pretty much maintains all organic carbon, continuous crop, sort of a steady decline over that period, and the fallow greater decline in soil organic carbon. So now I just want to make a comment about nitrogen. Nitrogen and soil and organic carbon are linked, and we know that if soil organic carbon is turned over, nitrogen is released out of that organic matter pool and becomes released as nitrate during the season, and our crops are pretty good at utilising that. So, but in a recent 2016, I think it was, Rob Norton did some sort of audits on inputs in our cropping systems, and in a lot of cases, their nitrogen inputs are less than what's actually been removed out of the paddock in the grain. So that extra nitrogen's coming from that organic matter or soil organic carbon pool. So we're effectively mining that from the pool and running that soil organic carbon down, which is reducing fertility, and that's going to flow through to productivity and ultimately profit. So I guess the question is, can we address that by that total sort of loss of fertility by extra nitrogen? And I think probably what it's telling us, we need to put more on and not mine as much. But ultimately there's benefits in having fertile soils, because when we get really good years, we get more nutrients out of that from that inherent fertility, which is really going to drive yields and drive profits. So just going on to talking about the profit side of it, and probably don't want to dwell on this, but I could elaborate on it if anybody would like to. But I guess everybody gets it really, that we use rotations to manage some of those constraints to production, like diseases, weeds. We can control some weeds better in some crops than others. For grass weeds, for example, easier to control in pulses and canola than cereals. It gives us a chance to use different modes of action and different weed control tactics, soil types. Some crops are adapted to some soil types and not others. Management logistics are really just, thinking about efficiencies in this sort of era of bigger areas of the same crop. People are just electing to make it sort of simple for the sake of, or at least have consistent big areas of the one crop to make it easier to manage. but on the other, I guess the other point there is about just managing risk. So, production risk, grow different crops to, I guess, you can have events like frost or heat shocks that'll impact badly on one crop and perhaps not the others to the same degree. Also financial risk, these are pretty self-explanatory, I guess. Commodity prices, the range of crops, not exposed to, I guess, a disastrous price drop in one particular crop. Costs, we can elect to grow crops that cost less to grow. Cash flow may be tight after a dry year or whatever. Minimise losses. I guess the point there was, perhaps you could put crops that are a high input, for example, canola, relatively expensive to grow those crops in a situation where there might be stored water, so that you can put a base to production there on the possibility that it is a low rainfall year. But I guess the final point there is looking at overall farm performance is it's when you're looking at dropping a paddock out or putting a paddock to green manure, for example, it's easy to focus on foregoing income on that paddock, but in actual fact, in terms of the overall whole farm, it may not make a lot of difference to the bottom line, because one, especially if that paddock's got a problem and you do crop it, the costs will probably be higher. I'm thinking if you had a weed problem, for example, harder to manage those weeds, possibly won't yield as well because of that weeds, which may not get as good a control. So the margin on that crop might be pretty small anyway, so you're not forgoing as much income as you might think. And then on the other side of the equation, there's a payoff down the track if you add carbon, plant-based carbon to the soil. That's going to help with fertility, and that's going to help drive performance down the track. So just to summarise there, to improve soils, you need to add more carbon than is being removed or turned over by microbes, and practices like no-till and retaining residues, utilising pasture phases, green and brown manures, cover crops, they all are adding more plant-based carbon and have been demonstrated to add to soil organic carbon. But and then I guess the last couple of points there is rotations, crop rotations, which is again pretty much standard practice. We use them to manage constraints to production and risk, and the payoff is increased fertility and increased production. So I think I'll leave it there, Prue.
Thank you very much, John. We haven't had any questions come in at this stage, but I'll give everybody a moment or so to pop any questions that they do have into the chat box. While we're waiting, John, how much room to move do you think there are in current Wimmera rotations? We do grow a lot of pulses, and we're pretty lucky in that most of us can grow reasonably diverse rotations. What is the room to move that we have in terms of changing or altering our rotations to both improve soil organic carbon and increase our profitability?
I think you've probably summarised it quite well, that we have got a lot of opportunity, and we are fortunate in that medium rainfall zone that we can sort of utilise pulse crops and have got that diversity. I think I mean a lot of people are already, that's from what I see, are already adopting those things as standard practice. So probably where there's an opportunity, if you're sort of in the higher end of the medium rainfall zone, is maybe pasture phases, if for those people that run a livestock operation as well. And I certainly see that livestock have been very profitable over the last few years, and that's been great for the farming system, and giving the opportunity to utilise those pasture phases to build carbon. I guess the other one, really is green manure or brown manure in there. And if we keep managing all those other constraints, we've got to, we'll build organic carbon. If we grow good crops, that's going to mean we've got more residue, bigger root systems. We're going to be putting more plant-based carbon back into the system. So I don't think there's not an easy sort of answer or recipe there. It's a combination of, I think, good farming practice and to make sure that we are adding that carbon back into the system. And that probably includes, thinking about how we're using nitrogen as well. I guess I could elaborate on that a bit too, on the nitrogen. So our traditional, rules of thumb or measurement, I'm talking about myself, I guess, working out nitrogen requirements, we've always sort of factored in a component for mineralisation. And, I think in recent years, it's sort of become obvious that, well, there's two aspects. One, that by doing that, we're running down soil carbon. But the other one is that isn't released during the winter, during the season. So it doesn't really contribute to a lot to nitrogen supply until the spring. So, in our environment, really, we've got to set up that yield potential earlier in the season. So I guess in my own work, I've become a lot less reliant on, I don't really consider that mineralisation component, and try and address the crop's requirements a bit earlier.
Perfect. Thanks, John. We've had no other questions come in, so we'll wrap it up. Thank you for your time, John, and thank you to our audience for joining in. Our next webinar in the series won't be until June 15, as I'm aware you're all flat out with cropping. When we resume, we'll be hearing from Dr. Kate Burke on using soil moisture data to reap rewards from taking risks. I'll put a link to the webinar registration in the chat. I'll also include a link to our most recent webinar on intercropping with AgVic's Ash Wallace, which said some really recent and interesting Wimmera trial data looking at productivity, economics and logistics around intercropping, so growing 2 or more crops at the same time in the same paddock. Once this webinar finishes, you will be directed to a survey link. It would be very, very much appreciated if you could please fill it out for us. The survey won't take any more than 2 minutes to complete, and your input is really important for us in planning and evaluating this and other activities. Thank you again for participating in today's webinar, supported by the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare Program, and I hope that you all have a lovely day.